I lost my page here. Defensive swamps.
Good evening, everyone. This is Nevin of the Populist Patriot, your host. And today we're going to have yet another episode with the geopolitical genius,
Oh, come on.
our very own Jeff Nyquist. Well, let me tell you something. You have a lot better insights than many in the conventional world of politics and national security studies, that's for sure. That's why we bring you on the show, because one of your many strong suits is your analysis of national security affairs. And welcome back to the show.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us again. And I wanted to pick your brain a little bit about what's going on in Ukraine and Russia. We'll start off with the military front and casualties.
Yeah.
Why aren't the Russians kicking the butts of the Ukrainians? Russia has superior forces, and the Ukraine is being portrayed as successfully resisting.
Yeah.
What's going on here? What's going on? Tell us some of your insights.
Well, people who haven't studied military campaigns, especially in that part of the world, and I've studied, the history of the Eastern Front, the fighting that happened in World War II over the same ground. And there's a condition, it's called rasputitsa. It happens in the spring, and it can happen early. It can start in winter if you've got a warmer winter. And what it is it's a soft ground condition. Normally in February and January, you have this period where the ground could be frozen so it can support heavy vehicles, and the dirt roads are frozen so that even wheeled vehicles can drive on them depending on the snow cover. And what we had in February is you had these temperatures above freezing 2-3 times a week or better. Actually, on the day of the attack, it was raining in Kiev intermittently. To give you an idea, it was overcast. Sun's not out. Ground doesn't dry. In fact, all that snow melt just makes the ground saturated with water. So what you have is if a tank, you got 40-plus ton Russian tanks, you've got APCs, you've got self-propelled artillery guns. They go off a paved road, and with some exceptions, unless the ground is rocky or something to support the tank, it's going to sink down to its axles. Same thing with supply vehicles. So what do? You're going to, these are mechanized infantry, combined arms armies, tank, guards, tank armies, guards, or combined arms tank army. These are the formations we're talking about, and they're vehicle formations. The men use the vehicles for the speed of maneuver and whatnot. And what is it when your forces are stuck on a paved road? Just imagine I'm defending and you're attacking along only paved roads. Well, all I have to do is set up around the paved roads ambushes, and you're driving down the paved road and you just get hit. So you can't effectively attack unless you can spread out, make a formation, and advance in a line, and then play the flanking game here and there and try to find holes or openings in the enemy line and flank them. They couldn't do that. The Russians couldn't bring their superior numbers to bear. I mean, you've got a Ukrainian brigade, because it's only having to defend the axis waves on the paved roads, can be fairly heavily concentrated, and in modern warfare favors defense. Ever since the Civil War, in terms of firepower, the defender, imagine advancing into somebody who's positioned to shoot you. You're advancing, they're going to get the first shot on you, and they're going to just absolutely hit you pretty hard. So this is what's happening to the Russians. They're having to do frontal attacks. They can only do flanking attacks using airborne and air mobile forces, which are lighter, more subject to heavy casualties and counterattacks. And so they've suffered heavy casualties. But in this kind of weather, historically in that part of the world, doesn't matter if the Germans or the Soviets were the attackers, they were going to get inordinately heavy losses, more like World War I attrition losses, without capturing much ground. And this is what we've seen. The Russian forces advanced a little ways into the country and were stuck and weren't able to advance more, because the minute they encountered the Ukrainian forces, they could only budge them a little here and there.
And that could change, as you mentioned, in some of your latest analysis available on J.R. Nyquist's blog. That could change in a couple of months when the ground is dry. Now, once the ground is dry, and once that disadvantage is taken away, what do you predict would happen on the Ukraine-Russian battlefront? Do you think the
Well,
Russians beat them? What are your
I'll
thoughts?
imagine that you have, 20 something Ukrainian brigades defending a line, and this is a, 1,000 kilometer front, shaped sort of like a horseshoe. You got Ukraine in the north, you've got Odessa in the south, and you've got Russian forces pushing down up from Crimea and down from Belarusia. Then you've got the Russian forces in the east. Of course, I'm oriented reverse because I'm facing a camera, but you get the idea. It's what they call a double envelopment. And the problem is those 20 odd defending Ukrainian brigades, where you're going to have 30 or 40 attacking Russian brigades, probably when it gets to the dry ground. Well, those brigades cannot effectively cover that long of a line. What is the size of a front on the dry ground that a brigade could cover? I don't know. It'd be stretching it to give each brigade 20 kilometers. Well, that's not going to cover it. You're going to have huge holes. The Russians, using their satellites, using their air reconnaissance, they're going to see where those holes are. They're just going to drive formations through the holes, and they're just going to envelop the Ukrainian brigades unless the Ukrainian brigades start to fall back to try to get a shorter line, fall back into Western Ukraine. So that's what's going to happen. The Ukrainians are going to rapidly be driven back or encircled. Their brigades are going to be put under intense pressure, and the Russians will, for the first time, be able to maneuver and be able to use their superior numbers and superior artillery and everything much more effectively than in this kind of weather. So that's why, if the Russians have the patience to wait another 10 weeks or 8 weeks, whenever the spring rains come to an end and the sun comes out and the ground bakes, that's what's going to happen.
And is there any chance for the Ukrainians to beat the Russians in the long term?
Not if the Russians persist. It's if what I think Vladimir Putin told the guy who was trying to make some kind of peace deal, Abramovich,
Mhm.
I'm going to thrash them. If
Yes.
Putin is determined and he can hold his government together and his army together, he will ultimately defeat Ukraine. The long-term prospects for Ukraine maintaining its independence are not so good, unless, of course, Russia feels it's taking too much damage from the sanctions and would like to try to have a larger kind of negotiation with the West. The West, of course, is almost hysterical in its moral denunciations of the Russian regime, which of course makes it difficult for the Russian regime then to walk anything back because they know they're gonna be punished. So the Russians have said, as of tomorrow or Friday, that the Europeans are going to have to pay for their natural gas in rubles, and if they don't do it, they're going to be cut off. And of course, it's still not exactly warm in Europe. This is late March. It's not as cold as where I am, but it's it's not going to be totally comfortable. And of course, I had a German lady write to me. She lived and grew up in East Germany, and she's really upset that there's going to be rationing in Germany. That they're going to be short of diesel, gasoline, and natural gas because the Russians are going to cut them off if they don't start transacting in rubles. And of course, the if Europe starts paying for oil in rubles, that's going to hurt the dollar.
And that's the perils, once again, of doing trade with any expansionist totalitarian regime. I mean, it makes a mockery, and this is one of the many reasons why I abandoned free market, free trade principles, at least in theory. I'm reminded of the famous quote by Frederick Bastiat, the French classical liberal globalist economist and politician, who said that if goods don't cross borders, armies will. Well, that's nonsense because goods are used by countries and governments particularly authoritarian or totalitarian ones, as weapons to subjugate other target countries rather than
Yeah,
see an enemy.
yeah, and a good example is Germany and Britain before World War One. A lot of people who think like a lot of our leaders think economically said Germany and Russia could never be enemies in a war because their trade was so extensive, right?
Mhm.
Well, that turned out to be totally false. I think Neil Ferguson has written extensively on this, the economic historian and professor. And then there's this. You've probably heard of this book.
Yes,
This
that
is a concept of the
understood.
political by Carl Schmitt. The reason why that's important is Carl Schmitt says that political entities are really always organized under a them us kind of principle, an enemy friend distinction. An enemy friend distinction is fundamental to the political regime. And what he's kind of arguing in this book, in a roundabout way, is that bourgeois regimes, people who believe in free trade and believe that the world is a giant global market or a shopping mall, don't quite understand politics. That all political groupings are organized around friend enemy distinctions, that everybody cannot be your friend, right? It is not necessarily that they're always your enemy, but you're going to have times where certain your interests of your group are not identical to others. There's going to be conflict. And so people have to be really wary of a kind of politics that says that all differences can be ameliorated. And and you've got, especially in the West, you've got this idea if you don't join the shopping mall, if you're not part of the global capitalist market and the morality of, and it's really a hedonistic morality, although they parade their human rights. I mean, they're softer and they're more warm and fuzzy, so they like human rights. But let's face it, these are the West dropped two atomic bombs on Japan when, in my military opinion was, and this is Douglas MacArthur's opinion too, they didn't really need to drop those atomic bombs on Japan, to be honest. You know, and so there's there's problems with the politics and international politics based on a kind of self-righteousness. I'm not saying that Vladimir Putin's government isn't a despotic kleptocracy where the president of Russia orders the assassination of journalists and dissidents. He does. He's a murderer. But having said that, I'm a private citizen. I can evaluate him. If I'm the president of the United States or the prime minister of a country, I don't go around saying we need regime change because he's a murderer. Because you're talking about nuclear war. It's just the same reason why you don't assassinate foreign generals or leaders because they're gonna do it back to you. Then where are you? You know.
Let me segue into a point, and you addressed this trade relations too. You're referencing Biden with his regime change comments, which I think are totally reckless, given the power of Russia. You don't want to play Russian roulette, no one pun intended, with a power that is out to basically get you, for the lack of a better
Yeah.
term. And one of the genius moves by President Biden, I say that with extreme sarcasm,
Sarcasm.
is now all of a sudden to cope with the sanctions on Russian oil, which I don't think we should import a drop of Russian oil or Saudi oil for that matter. But now he's holding negotiations with Iran and Venezuela, two of Russia's most staunchest partners and allies. And he's saying, let's import oil from those two countries. Why in Sam Hill is that crazy loon of a president doing this?
Well,
What's
yeah,
the
I mean, I
point?
mean, if I look, it's not crazy. Biden is not really the enemy of Russia. Let me break it to you. He's going to go hat in hand to Venezuela because, well, he has to pretend that he's Russia's enemy. But he's thinking, well, nobody's slick enough to figure out that he can cozy up to Russia's, top friends, right? Iran and Venezuela. That nobody's going to notice that basically getting oil from Venezuela and Iran is the same thing as getting it from Russia. And but the thing is, the Venezuelans, as I understand it, have basically told him to take a hike. I mean, The problem here is that, look, it's like Anatoly Golitsyn said in 1984, beware the economic weapons of the bloc, the communist bloc. Grain and oil, in this case, fertilizer and oil. We're talking about, look at, I think I read this morning that several Ukrainian grain ships have been sunk by the Russian Navy. This grain is headed to Africa and the Middle East. That's grain to feed the billion people that live in that part of the world. Countries like these Middle Eastern countries that do not have populations far in excess of their domestic food production. And they get their food largely from countries like Ukraine and Russia and Belarus. So you cut that food down, and then you've got the cutoff of fertilizer imports from China, from Belarus, from Russia into North America, into Africa and Europe. And you say, wait a minute, our soils are exhausted. We've been feeding nearly 8 billion people in this world. And we're not using the old-fashioned farming. We're not using sustainable farming. We need those petrochemical fertilizers to sustain this global population, and they're closing the gates, right? They are creating, the communist bloc has stockpiled. China is said to have 67% of the grain reserves of the world that they have spent evidently years to stockpile. Nobody had a clue until recently. And now they're going to cut off fertilizer. This is economic warfare on the basis of the most principal commodities there are, energy and food. And so do they have a potent weapon here? Yeah, I'm thinking this is really striking to me. I talked to a guy who's really, keen on business. He knows how, he's very creative. He knows how to create businesses and to generate wealth. And he said, well, we have the creativity. Our market system can adjust. But one thing I do know, that the only thing that really constricted Germany, not the bombing in World War II, I'm talking, our strategic bombing didn't really didn't stop their war production. The one thing that stopped their war machine and their war production was when the Romanian oil fields were occupied by the Soviet army in late second half of 1944. Then all of a sudden, the Germans only had the synthetic oil fuel that they could produce in their synthetic factories, and the little oil that they got from Hungary. So basically, what you have here is that energy inputs are a fundamental choke point. And when it comes to the large populations we have, food is a fundamental choke point too, especially for social unrest in that belt of countries from Morocco all the way to Pakistan. What happens when those regimes become desperate, when those governments are destabilized, and what happens to the price of food when food is so mobile, moving around the world? What happens to the price of food here in the United States, and especially in Europe? Because Europe, remember, I'm not sure Europe can feed itself.
Well, yeah, because this is why I'm an economic nationalist. I mean, let's not be mistaken. I agree with trade between free nations to a degree, while at the same time balancing their national industries. But at the same time, this is why we don't have any economic interdependence with government dominated economic sectors that are present in countries like Russia and China. This is precisely why what you've gone through is why I'm an economic nationalist of the American School of Political Economy. But you mentioned something about Biden, and I want to unpack this. About Biden pretending to be the enemy of the Russians. One of the things that constantly jogs my head, I brought this up on previous programs on the Populist Patriot and my writings too as well. Biden, on foreign policy, never really was a friend of American interests, to put it mildly. I mean, there's some rather extremely distressing information about him and his interactions with the old Soviet Union, with his promotion of permanent normal trade relations with the Chinese and the Russians.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us about things, starting with that sinister document that was reported by Vladimir Bukovsky, a Politburo document dated from 1979, where Biden was basically saying, yeah, we're just going to pretend to do something about dissidents to show the world, but in reality, we ain't going to do squat about them. Why don't you take us a little bit, and I wish Trevor Loudon would join us. Maybe we can do a future program with him,
Hmm.
because he's very good about chronicling a lot of this information. What's going on in Biden's record? Let's unpack this.
Well, Biden is a guy that, just in general terms, the communists had limited resources back in the 70s and 80s to get people, slip their kind of guys into the U.S. Senate. So they picked small states. Armand Hammer, who was, according to the Edward J. Epstein's Hammer file, was a KGB agent. If you read the Hammer file, you see Epstein got a hold of records from interwar Germany from the 20s when Armand Hammer operated there, and from France, and showing how those declassified records from their intelligence services showed that Hammer was an agent of the Soviet government, and his companies were front companies for that government. So here you have Armand Hammer operating in the United States, supporting Al Gore Sr., later Al Gore Jr. out of Tennessee, a small state, and supporting Joe Biden out of Delaware, right? But Biden, in order to get elected, Delaware is a conservative state. It's the state of Spiro T. Agnew, right? Nixon's vice president, who was really a kind of ultra conservative, who ended up having to resign because of a scandal. Um, and what you've got in Biden is a guy that portrayed himself as sort of a social conservative, or a regular kind of guy, a conservative on domestic issues, but really kind of a very sneaky way of portraying himself on foreign policy. You could hear him say, "Oh, I want America to be strong," but every time he would vote against defense bills. He would vote against, things that Reagan wanted. He would vote in things that were helpful to the Soviet Union, right? And it's pretty clear that's his record. I think Trevor has talked about this, and things that are super visible that he would get caught out at. He was good at you know parsing his position. And I think the fact that he was picked. Look, Al Gore was picked to be Bill Clinton's running mate and vice president. That's very telling, given that Clinton went behind the Iron Curtain as a Rhodes Scholar in a British university. He went behind the Iron Curtain in the winter of 1969 to 70, and he went to Moscow by himself. What kind of tourism is that? You go to a place in winter. Moscow is a miserable place to visit in the winter. And then he goes to Prague, another communist capital. And there's stories that have circulated about those trips of his. And look we know Hillary Clinton was a radical. She was a basically self-confessed at one point communist in her younger days. And these two radicals, Bill and Hillary, got together and painted themselves middle of the road Democrat in Arkansas. And so, but he picks Al Gore, this creature, Al Gore Jr., this senator from Tennessee, who was really made by Arm & Hammer. And you have the same thing. Obama comes in and he picks Joe Biden, another senator of the same stamp. Um, so when you look, there's no way that people of this coloring can be honest enemies of Moscow or Beijing. And you've seen all the news is about the Hunter Biden laptop and these business deals with the communists in China and the Bidens. It's all over the news now. And so this I would say communist bloc connectivity to Joe Biden. And you look at the people around him. You look at the kind of people he picks to be around him. You look at his advisors. You look at the people he's attempted. He tried to pick a woman as comptroller of the currency. I forget her name now. She didn't get confirmed, but she was a Soviet educated with her PhD from Moscow State University, naturalized American citizen with some peculiar views, to say the least. So I think quite clearly, I mean, people would call it, well, I'm just a progressive, No, you're not. You're as red as a fire truck, and of course, you're connected to all the usual suspects. So that's how we would characterize Mr. Biden. The idea, look, you know this, that the idea that Vladimir Putin is a Christian and is a conservative or a Russian nationalist. I have followed Russian nationalists. You can read the real Russian nationalists are beat up by the police in Moscow when they protest the importing of Central Asian workers into Russian cities to supplant Russian workers. When Russians protest the building of the biggest I think it's the biggest mosque in the world in Moscow. The building of it, I remember I used to talk to a friend in Moscow whose flat was across the street, and I would hear the construction. This is, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago. And I'd say, what is that? Oh, they're building this giant mosque across the street. It's like in Moscow, yeah, it's going to be the biggest mosque in the world. It's like, so what I'm saying is that Putin is not a nationalist. He pretends to love the Russian Orthodox Church, but you'll hear him say, I'm the greatest friend of the Muslims, in the world. Putin will say things like this. And he's got all these funny Islamist friends, like warlord Kadyrov from Chechnya, and all those wonderful Hezbollah people down there in the Middle East, in Iran, the clerics in Iran. So, he's a Soviet-minded figure, and you read, his declaration of war speech basically on Ukraine was the breakup of the Soviet Union was illegal, which means that in his mind, legally, his country is the Soviet Union, and the special operation, not an invasion, mind you, special operation in Ukraine is basically asserting the Soviet Union. This is our territory. It belongs to the Soviet Union. We're gonna be reunited. We're gonna be putting the Humpty Dumpty is putting the, being put together, I should say. And so, yeah, if that makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, Putin is a creature of the Soviet system. He's a product of the Soviet system. For every time that he says he's a Christian, I can find you certain quotes that he said he's sympathetic to socialist and communist ideas. As he said one time in 2016, another time said that communism and Christianity are compatible. I mean, we can debate that till.
Well, he said they're similar or almost the same thing. Yeah.
This is not somebody, when he criticizes Lenin, I really have to take it with a grain of salt.
Well, you got to listen to him carefully. He isn't really criticizing Lenin.
No, he's not.
He's not. He's saying it very subtly. He's saying, look, Lenin created Ukraine as a republic, and it was sort of a formality. It was a mistake because Lenin, of course, didn't know how that was going to be used later to hurt the Soviet Union. So, and he's explaining it, but look, if he was really against Lenin, he would have buried him.
Exactly.
Lenin is sitting out in Red Square in his mausoleum. More alive than all the living, as the Soviets say.
Yeah, I mean, he wouldn't be paying fealty to the Soviet system if he repudiated Lenin. He wouldn't be speaking before the old Soviet front group, which still exists, the World Youth Festival in 2017 in Sochi, saying, I am with you. And included in there were American hardline tanky communists like Caleb Maupin, for example. I mean, It's just, I don't believe it. There's too much evidence that contradicts what disturbingly a number of sort of right-wing populist conservatives are saying about Putin. What do you think? There are two strands of conservative thought on Russia, of conservative incorporated, we'll call it. One side, you have the free trade, Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, sort of Reaganite trickle-downers. They say the right things about Russia and Putin, how terrible an expansionist he is. Mm-hmm. But then they support trade relations. They don't want a severe limiting of trade, at least until recently. In fact, under Obama, these same Reaganite Tea Party type conservatives joined with Obama to grant Putin permanent normal trade relations. That's one wing of conservatism. I call it the conservative two-step. The other conservative wing, you have people like Michael Savage and Tucker Carlson and Patrick Buchanan. They are claiming that Putin is a Christian, he is a Russian patriot and nationalist, that we're forcing Russia into the arms of China. And they're overly sympathetic to the Russian point of view without taking a more critical look. Some of them, like Dr. Michael Savage, was even very critical of Putin's Russia, felt it was a reincarnation of Soviet Union. Our last interview, we talked about that, and I provided evidence of that. What the heck is going on here based on your knowledge of conservatives, your dealings with them, your experience? It's very confusing. What's going on? Tell the
Well,
audience.
people don't, too many Americans are not acquainted with nuanced objective thinking in politics. It's either rah rah this or down with that, right? So they can't look at things and say, well, maybe there's something on the other side to be said. Maybe we need to have a more grown-up view of things, that it's not this a bunch of slogans one way or the other. Um, I don't, I followed Pat Buchanan. I voted for him in 1992 and 96 in the Republican primaries in those days. But I'm very disappointed in him because he does not show that he has done his homework about Russia. He has not understood that Russia is a reorganized form of the Soviet state. The nomenclature, the same people are in charge. The mafia Soviet system, which is a complex, almost feudal kind of system, related to the house that Stalin built. Really, the only really way that system ever functioned is still the system they have in place there, and that what they did is they prettied it up with a new economic policy like thing where they allowed joint ventures from foreign companies where they own 51%, and they could basically boot out their Western partners and take the cash or the machine tools and the factories for themselves. And they played this game the Soviet Union played in the 1920s. And they played it again in the 90s and the early first 2 decades of the 21st century. And it allowed them to rebuild their military and to play a little catch up technologically in their economy to be more adaptive. But essentially, their billionaires are puppets of the political structures. And a lot of people don't understand what the mafia is. The mafia is the system of how the Soviets managed their economies, because the command economy really never worked. So the system works on the basis of restricting consumption and the state being the biggest consumer, right, of goods, which meant at the time heavy industry and military goods. Forget about light industry and consumer goods. So they really haven't changed that much. They've changed a little bit. And Russia has a sort of a kind of poor middle class of independent people who have small businesses that don't make very much money, but they love their independence. That's the only difference. And right now, those are the people that are protesting this war. That's the heart and soul of the creative part of the country, and they're just politically always stepped on. They're second-class citizens, really. And the system is constantly bilking them and taking advantage of them. And this is what happened in Ukraine. That class of people started a revolt, wanting more freedom, wanting more openness, wanting the economy to be freer, wanting economic reforms, and the system wasn't going to give it because Ukraine also was a Soviet country with residual Soviet institutions. And that's why they had the Orange Revolution and the Euromaidan Revolution. That's why those things happened. And that's why this war is happening. It's a civil war in the Soviet Union. That's essentially what it is.
Well, yes, it all started with the Euromaidan revolution and with the overthrow of the Party of Regions and Viktor Yanukovych, who led the Party of Regions, who acted as a dictator in Ukraine at the time and was a creature of Putin, essentially, was a strong tied ally of him. Now, there have been reports surfacing about foreign forces that are helping the Russians. Syrians, Chechenians from the Chechen Republic that you referenced earlier, which is led by an absolute caricature of a thug in
Mhm.
Chechnya. I mean,
Yeah.
Kadyrov is like just wow. Um, we also have a number of other countries that are allied to Putin. South Ossetia, you have Nicaragua,
Abkhazia,
Abkhazia, and others.
Transnistria.
And which is now I think Moldova.
Well,
Um,
no, it's just a fragment of Moldova.
oh, it's a frag.
Yeah, it's
Okay,
a fragment.
thank you for the clarification. But there are Syrians supposedly wanting to fight the Chinese. Now, finally, it's getting publicized that China and Russia have been negotiating for outright weapon shipments to Russia and financial aid. Although that kind of, as we talked about offline, that type of cooperation has existed for decades between Russia and China, even during their so-called split. Um,
By the way, I think that this idea that Russia is begging China for help is a deception. It is an attempt by Russia to appear weaker than Russia is.
mhm,
Russia has a very fine military industry, and they have
yes.
plenty of good equipment. Why they're not putting their best equipment forward and they're putting their more greener troops forward is an interesting question in itself in this war.
Yes, and Russia has exported heavy weapons to China since 1989, 1990. There were open
Right.
negotiations back when the old Soviet Union still existed. And in some cases, some reports even during the 1980s, during when there was still officially a split. But can you catalog the different countries and movements abroad that are helping Russia on the diplomatic front and the military front? What do your sources suggest regarding that? The Syrians, the Iranians,
Well, I
Cuba?
think that the Venezuelans and the Iranians are in line with this energy policy, with the trade war. I think that there is a block of countries, China and Russia are the leaders, but there's a block of countries that would include, I believe, South Africa, Pakistan, Iran, Syria. You've got Angola, Congo. These are mineral rich countries. Namibia, um, uh, um, uh, Zimbabwe. You've got Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba in the Western Hemisphere, and maybe some other countries in there that are, Peru has a basically a new communist president essentially, and other regimes in Latin America are a part of this Sao Paulo forum that Lula da Silva and Fidel Castro created 3 decades ago, about 3 decades ago. And of course, you've got the Southeast Asian countries, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, and you've got North Korea. So you've got quite a communist bloc. And I don't forget Nepal. It became a Maoist not that long ago. And I'm probably leaving a few out, a few countries out. And you've got countries that are in a kind of middle position that could be swayed by this bloc. Countries like India that both have a closer relationship with Russia but a hostile relationship to China and are kind of being placed in a difficult position um, in that regard. And countries like Mexico, that is, despite what anyone's heard, its political structures are really very hostile to the United States, and that they mute that. But if the United States was ever in trouble, they would they would be strongly tempted to join with the enemies of the United States. As as the defector Colonel Stanislav Lunev told me, is the Zimmerman telegraph was the right idea, only at the wrong time. And the Zimmerman telegraph, for those that don't remember, is World War One. Zimmerman was a German diplomat who suggested that Mexico could join in the war on Germany's side and get the Southwest back from the United States. Of course, that was a completely crazy idea because Mexico did not have the wherewithal then to do that, and the United States was still very strong as a country, not would not have been able to be defeated. But if you have nuclear weapons in play, and you've got a country like China heavily involved in Mexico, where Chinese military formations and, assisted by missile strikes, nuclear missile strikes, that could become a reality. However crazy this may sound to the listeners, it is really the way Chinese and Russian military strategists think.
Well, not only that, it's not crazy. The guy can, well, I don't want to use the word assure you, but there is truth to that because the Soviets had a strategy, according to a former Polish ambassador to Japan, and he was present in conversations with Soviet officials. It was reported by Accuracy in Media in one of their newsletters from the 1980s. Zlatoslav Ruars,
Yeah,
R.A.
whereas, yeah,
Yeah, he revealed that the Soviets had a strategy that in the event of war with the United States, they would have tempted Mexico. They had a plan to bribe Mexico to support the Soviets in exchange for a takeback of lands that were occupied by the United States, taken over by the United States from Mexico. And they had a name for that at that time, Azatlan. And the Soviets had already were using that name in their strategic planning. And later, there are radical groups with the name Azatlan that were Marxist-Leninist in
Azatlan. Yeah,
implementation. Mm-hmm.
yeah.
So, what do we put two and two together here?
Oh, yeah.
Something's fishy, don't you think, Jeff? What's going on
Oh,
here?
yeah. Well, the history of socialism in Mexico is a terrible and violent one. Going back to the terribly violent Mexican Civil War or revolution of a century, a little more than a century ago. People don't realize. One expert in this, I attended a lecture on it in graduate school, and one expert said, "Look, this is controversial, but I think about a third of the people in Mexico died during that war." If you can
Mm.
imagine, this is the time of Emil Zapata, and of course Pancho Villa, these kind of characters, and it's Mexico went into a kind of anarchy, a kind of warlordism and extreme violence. Um, it's we don't, in outlining this communist bloc idea, the idea that it still exists. You don't want to use the term, oh, Nyquist, why do you use the term communist anymore? It's because the structures that hold it together, the larger structures, are the communist parties and communist movements. And I didn't forget to mention the FARC in Colombia. They're completely sewed into this. And of course, the Cuban regime is a Marxist-Leninist regime, just like, in essence, the Venezuelan regime, the North Korean, the three Southeast Asian regimes, China, and many of the regimes. Look, many of these regimes in Africa that are Marxist-Leninists. I mean, Kabila's Democratic People's Republic of the Congo, the Zimbabwe. And Angola declared themselves Marxist-Leninist states, decades ago. I think in the mid 80s, 84, 85. But then they said, "Oh no, we're not anymore." Well, the same ruling parties that were ruling them then are the ones that are in power now. No change, right? So they're still Marxist-Leninists. To claim that they're not is just one more communist deception. And so these countries in South Africa, the African National Congress is just a infiltrated organization by the Communist Party of South Africa. You know.
Well, yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned South Africa. There's an article I recently came across in mainstream news. I think it was either New York Times or Washington Post. And we take a look at this. South Africa, you have South African officials and leaders of the ANC, which is intimately tied to the South African Communist Party. I
Absolutely.
mean, you're repeating all the conspiracy theories linking Ukraine and the United States and all the rest of it, and definitely have a very pro-Russian slant. Now, I thought South Africa was supposed to be this free country after apartheid. I guess not. They're walking in the footsteps and they are aligned militarily on the intelligence front with the Russians. Let's
Yeah.
take Vietnam, for example. You know what they're calling the Vietnamese officials, the communist officials, and sympathetic citizens on the street? They refer to Putin as Uncle Putin. What is this term of deep respect, what they used to call Ho Chi Minh, the first communist dictator of North Vietnam. They used to refer to him as Uncle Ho, reverentially. And now they're giving all the massive respects to Putin. And I had a guess. He is a Vietnamese American. TQ. He's running as an independent for the U.S. Senate. You know what he told me, and this is on our last broadcast.
Hmm.
Everyone, he told me that in Vietnam, if you protest against China, they will throw you in jail and give you a harsher sentence than even people, Vietnamese nationals who protest against their own government. So what does this tell you about all these splits and everything? Because him and TQ and I got into Tuan Nguyen is his name, got into a discussion about this. He says, don't you can't exaggerate or overemphasize these splits.
No, you can't.
It,
Well, in
it,
fact,
what's
along
going
these same lines, a military expert with a lot of experience in Southeast Asia told me that basically the Politburos of the countries, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam, are basically completely stuffed with Chinese agents.
There you
So,
go.
it's like, and that kind of took, really? It's like, yeah, and I'm sure there's Russian agents in there too. There's there's a between Russia and China, there is a kind of a series of special arrangements with the direction of their satellites and the sort of mutual management of these satellites. Um, and there's a tremendous naivete in the West about these countries and their military potential and their, quite frankly, their economic potential in an economic war, which we have definitely now. We're at the very outset of an economic war. And economic war is only that far away from actual fighting war. I think people don't understand that. When you have an economic war, if it doesn't lead to a fighting war immediately, it almost certainly is going to lead to one eventually.
Well, what did I believe it was Stalin referred to the third world, the resource-rich third world that even then the West was dependent on? After all, he referred to it as the rear of imperialism.
Yeah,
And that,
yeah, yeah. I think Trotsky wrote something like the road to London is through Tehran, New Delhi, and uh, New Delhi, and maybe Mecca. I forget the third capital, but three of the capitals in Asia, and I think they were thinking this way more than 100 years ago. The Bolshevik leaders were. And a lot of people don't know Lenin, after the Bolshevik Revolution, one of the second things he did in terms of public announcement was to make an address to the Muslims of the Russian Empire, saying, you are our brothers against the imperialist powers. We're going to join with you. Islam is a religion that's compatible with Marxism. So, and we've seen this is been there's been in the Muslim world the development of these terrorist Islamist allies of either China or Russia. Russia's been heavily involved in that, from all the way from the assault on the Grand Mosque in 1979 to the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Look, the attempt to overthrow, to make a revolution in Saudi Arabia in 79, which would have been devastating to us. Those revolutionaries were trained, I think, by East Germans in Libya, in
correct.
Gaddafi's Libya, right?
Yes. Yes.
So those are communist. Those are basically communist insurgents, um, who are nominally or to some extent Islamic, but this melding. The Muslim. It's the fellow who wrote the first big book on Osama bin Laden, um, um, Badansky.
Joseph
Um,
Badansky. Joseph Badansky.
Joseph Badansky, his book on Osama bin Laden, talks about this, but that people don't realize he has in that book that the Muslim Brotherhood and the communist cells in Jordan formed a kind of pact in the 1960s. That there was this melding of communism and Islam in many areas in the Middle East, revolutionary Islam and revolutionary communism. And you would think politics make such strange bedfellows. But you see, the people don't. Communism is such a big, pervasive thing, not in terms of they have huge numbers in every country, but they're highly organized and they're effective in many of the countries they operate in. And they control the biggest country in the world, Russia, the most populous country in the world, China. Now, that's controversial to say about Russia, but I really believe it's true. And there's lots of evidence. You know it. You're one of the people that's done a lot of research. You know, you've written it's not was Gallitzin right? It's refresh.
Well, it's vindicated.
Gallitzin Vindicated, and of course, Red Dawn Revisited, right?
Red Dawn Revisited and Turning the Page, which I had
Yeah,
even information that covers the over-exaggerated or outright false splits
right.
block in China. I
Yeah,
even more information that's not even in
right.
Gallitzin.
I mean, you have dug into this deeper than anyone. I looked at it. I looked at the conspiracy and death of Lin Biao, and I found evidence, really striking correspondences. But you found as such a weight of data that it's astonishing. In terms of anybody that has gone up after Gallitzin and looked at and just you've dug up a treasure trove of basically proofs, evidences that Anatoly Golitsyn, who said that the communist bloc had a long-range strategy to fake the collapse of communism and to have a fake Sino-Soviet split to draw the West into a kind of um, um, I guess, irresponsible slackness and lack of readiness and a lack of vigilance. And then if you think of 9/11, to be distracted by a war against a bunch of Islamists hiding in caves in Pakistan or Afghanistan, we have been diverted. We have let things slide as far as being a great power. And Russia and China have built up hypersonic missiles, new nuclear warheads, all the rest of it, until the point where, I heard Peter Price say last week that I was speaking in the same forum that he was, that the United States is 30 years behind in strategic weapons. That is extremely horrific to hear from one of America's foremost experts in that area. And so, look, I think their strategy worked in a very large way. They had many mistakes. They had many defeats along the way, but they knew, when you assault a fortress, when you attempt a strategy, you're going to take losses. That's strategy. You're going to take losses, but in the end, your maneuver is going to pay off big time. And it's arguable that it has. And except for them stubbing their toe here in Ukraine, which gives us a lot of hope, maybe some of it false hope, is we're in trouble.
We really are. And I wanted to wrap up with this one other question. Well, where does it end? What is Putin's ultimate goal? Is it really just to stop in Ukraine? Is it to stop in Eastern Europe? He said to former President Poroshenko of Ukraine that, oh, I can take Poland and Romania within not even a few days.
Yeah, he said something like in 72 hours he could overrun, what did he say, 5 NATO capitals in 72 hours. And of course, those 5 NATO capitals are Tallinn, Estonia, Riga, Latvia, I forget the capital of Lithuania, Warsaw, Poland, Bucharest in Romania. And so that was maybe a little over optimistic, a bit of bragging, but you got to remember from Putin's point of view, he's seeing all our strategic mistakes. He's seeing how the balance of power has shifted towards him. And of course, attacking in the mud and looking like you've fallen on your face, I'm sure he's not happy about that. But he does have the preponderance in nuclear and missile weapons. He does have the West's political institutions penetrated. And he does have this economic strategy. And let me just tell you, if you want to know what's around the corner, this economic strategy is designed to put the hurt on our allies in Europe and Japan and Australia, etc., so that those countries ultimately have to cry uncle and say, look, you're murdering us here with the cutting off of the natural gas and the diesel and the gasoline. Let's make a deal, and the deal is going to be, well, you abandon the dollar and you abandon the United States. And the United States could very well find itself politically and strategically isolated together here on this continent with Canada without any overseas allies, without any overseas bases, with the communists flooding into the Caribbean and South America and Central America, building up in our own hemisphere. We could end up being Fortress America under siege and economic blockade by the whole rest of the world. It could literally evolve into that. And I don't know if anybody realizes this is where this economic warfare thing could take us if the Chinese and Russian economic strategy actually is able to work.
Well, and that's why, again, I've abandoned the ideology of free trade and Reaganism. That's why I abandoned it, because strategically it doesn't make sense. It's like Marxism economically goes against human nature. Well, free trade and perfect free market and free trade economics really doesn't work either, because it doesn't take into account externalities. And there are many different reasons with that. That's a different show. You mentioned one real quick point about political penetration. Not only do we have it within wings of the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, the conservative movement, but we also see in elements of the hardline left in the United States, groups like Democratic Socialists of America, to a degree the Communist Party USA, the Workers' World Party. You have outfits like Caleb Maupin's Center for Political Innovation. You have the Lyndon LaRouche movement, which still survives even after the death of its founder. We have some of the other hardline tanky groups, not all of them. They'll either give a little slap on the wrist to Putin, but if you read their literature, and I have, and I covered a show on this, it's like most of it is denunciations in the harshest terms of NATO and imperialism in the United States, and this and that, and blah, 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 blah. Sure, you'll have Code Pink protesting in front of the Russian embassy, and I give them plaudits for that, but they put the United States on the same par as Russia, or even denounce the United States more. And by the way, Medea Benjamin is in Taliban Afghanistan, consorting with the education ministry about women's schools, if you could believe it, in Taliban Afghanistan. Folks, this is why I don't like the hard left. There's never an anti-American dictatorship they didn't love. They denounce imperialism and capitalism. They're on it. They're backing it. What is your analysis of what's going on with the domestic far left in the United States vis-a-vis Russia right now?
Well, it's very strange. Well, you had the communists come out against Putin, the Communist Party USA, I understand. It was on Trevor Loudon's site. It was the first time I saw it, and somebody asked me about it. And it doesn't surprise me, because remember, the Communist Party USA is kind of orchestrating the general left, the coalition, what they call they call it a kind of larger movement for socialism in the United States. And of course, the game has been with the left in the United States, and that means the Democratic Party that's really controlled by its left wing. It means the Democratic Party has done this ever since they denounced Trump as a Russian puppet, ever since Hillary Clinton did that they are anti-Putin. And it actually goes back a little bit before that. They have disassociated themselves from Moscow, not necessarily from Beijing, but from Moscow. And what you have is you have a bifurcation where you have the conservatives being anti-China and being encouraged, like Pat Buchanan, for example, and like many of these conservative pundits, Tucker Carlson and whatnot, and being soft on Putin, or Putin is a Christian, or he's a nationalist, whatever, but thinking China's the dangerous country, Russia can be our ally, where you've got the opposite thing on the left. So that it seems like whoever comes to power in the United States, whether it's the left or the right, they're going to favor one or the other. So it's like the Sino-Soviet split split into two parties, right? You've got either one communist country is going to be helped by the United States or looked on favorably, or the other. You're never going to have Americans on the same page saying Russia and China are together. They're going to move against us at the same time. We're being played here, so that we're not together on who our enemy. Remember, concept of the political. It's a friend-enemy distinction, and we don't make the same. If we're a country, we're one country, and we're not making the same friend-enemy distinction. We're making a different friend-enemy distinction, which I think is part of a play to create a civil war here in the United States between the left and the right, which is something we must not have.
Absolutely. And for the record, I do not trust the Communist Party USA in its all of a sudden denunciation of Putin. I think that is strategic maneuver because, Jeff, before you give your concluding message and comments, how do you know a communist is lying? What do you always say?
Well, because his lips are moving, right?
Exactly.
They lie even when it doesn't seem to make sense, if only to keep in practice.
Exactly. So as far as I'm concerned, the denunciation by the CPUSA is a lot of bollocks.
It's a tactical maneuver. They would call it a tactical maneuver.
Exactly.
And of course, that has been a pro-Moscow party from its inception. And of course, this is not to be trusted. It's not to be trusted.
No. Because if their lips are moving, they're lying.
They're lying.
It's nothing personal. It's their strategic doctrine. I call communists strategic pragmatists.
Right. And for them, given that the fact that the Communist Party see themselves as the vanguard and the leaders of the American left, they have to take this stand because that's where the American left has been going, is in this denouncing Putin direction. But you can't take it seriously.
Yeah. Are there leftists that are sincerely critical of the hardline, tanky left? Absolutely.
Oh, yeah, of course.
But you're going to end up like the anarchists and the social revolutionaries and the Mensheviks in Bolshevik Russia. And people will say, well, it can't happen in the United States. Well, as you mentioned earlier, if conditions are right, they can take power if this country collapses because they're highly organized. We saw that happen in Russia. They didn't even have 500,000 Bolsheviks in 1917 in a country of tens, if not hundreds of millions of people, and they managed to subjugate an entire country. So be very careful. Any highly organized political army can move mountains, and we've seen that in history. Do you have any concluding comments for tonight's show, Jeff?
Well, I'll just conclude after what you said. Look, political power and political organization is made by small groups. Small groups organize political parties. They create oligarchies. They can control and manipulate and manage the rest of society. This is what happens all the time. This is Robert Michel's iron law of oligarchy, right? Even under democracy, winning elections requires organization. Organization is the function of a minority of organizers, and therefore the power belongs to them. So democracy is just another way of organizing oligarchy. Sorry, folks, but that is the political realist analysis. So anyway, I'll leave everybody with that.
Well, this has been, once again, an excellent show. I want to thank you for joining us, Jeff, for tonight's program. As I said, we're going to have you on many times. Several of our subscribers have noted they would like to see Alan DeSantis, you, me, Trevor Loudon, Diana West, and others back on sort of roundtable shows like what we used to have. I definitely agree with that. Would love to have Trevor and Alan and other analysts on the show. Maybe we can do a roundtable. This way we can exchange insights. And no, as usual, you're a fountain of knowledge, a wealth of knowledge, and it's sincerely appreciated. And of course, we'll have you back on soon.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, and Nevin.
Okay, take care. God bless, and God bless America, and have a good night.